I kept the attic locked for 22 years. When my son married a woman who smiled at me like I was already dead, I changed the combination. 3 weeks later, he called me from a work trip, his voice barely holding together. Dad, she got in. She found everything. And I told him, good, because I'd been waiting for exactly this. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. I was in a rental car outside a hardware store in Knoxville when my son called. I'd been out there visiting an old college friend for 4 days. First real trip I'd taken since my knee replacement last spring. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and I saw his name light up. My son never called during the week unless something was wrong. He knew I hated interruptions when I was traveling. He knew my schedule better than I knew it myself. I picked up before the second ring. Dad. Her voice shook in a way I hadn't heard since he was maybe 15, and crashed my truck into the mailbox. She got into the attic. I don't know how she figured out the combination, but she did. She's up there right now. I can hear her moving around. I set down the coffee I'd been holding and stared at the parking lot. What did she take? I asked. Nothing yet. I don't think. But she's going through things. There are papers everywhere. Dad, she's on the phone with someone. She sounds angry. Of course she was angry. She'd spent the better part of 3 years working towards something she thought was up in that attic, and what she'd found wasn't what she imagined. I'd made sure of that. Don't let her take anything, I said. I'm booking a flight home today. And son, don't sign a single thing she puts in front of you. Not even something that looks routine. Promise me that. A pause, long enough that I felt it in my chest. Okay, Dad, I promise. I hung up and sat there for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel. 22 years. 22 years I'd kept that door locked, and now the moment I'd been dreading and quietly preparing for had arrived all at once. I need to back up. My wife, Cecile, died of a brain aneurysm when my son was 19 years old. There was no warning. She was 51, healthy, laughing at something on the television one Tuesday evening, and then she was gone. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just takes. Cecile had been a paralegal for 26 years. She understood legal documents the way other people understand weather. Instinctively, with a practiced eye for what was coming. 6 months before she died, she'd done something I didn't understand at the time. She'd gone to an estate attorney on her lunch break and spent 3 afternoons putting together a trust. She hadn't told me right away. She brought it home on a Wednesday in a manila folder and set it on the kitchen table while I was making dinner. I think we should protect what we have, she said, just in case. I thought she meant in case of taxes or market fluctuations. She was practical like that. But sitting across from her while she walked me through the documents, I started to understand she was thinking about something more specific. She'd grown up watching her grandmother lose a house to her grandmother's second husband after her grandfather died. The man had charmed his way into that family in less than a year and walked away with almost everything. Cecile had been 12 years old. She never forgot it. The trust she set up named our son as the sole beneficiary. Not his future spouse, not a business partner, not a creditor. Him, specifically by name, with language she and the attorney had carefully drafted to withstand challenge. The house we'd paid off together, the investment accounts we'd built over decades, my life insurance, all of it folded into something she designed to be difficult to reach. Without a court fight, no reasonable person would win. She made me promise to guard it until he was ready. When our son was in his late 20s and starting to date seriously, I went back to her attorney and added the second layer. I learned everything I needed to know about how Colorado handled inherited and trust-held property in a marriage. I asked the right questions, and when my son told me 3 years ago that he was planning to propose to a woman he'd been dating for 11 months, I called that attorney again the same evening. Her name was Rochelle. She was 31 when I first met her. Beautiful, there's no other word for it, with a kind of self-possession that reads as confidence until you spend a few dinners with her and realize it's something harder and colder than that. She showed up to our first meeting, a Sunday dinner I'd made from scratch, wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. She complimented the house 4 times in the first 10 minutes. Not me, not my son, not the food. The house. She asked me that evening whether I'd thought about downsizing. I told her I liked my space. She laughed like I'd made a joke and changed the subject. But something in the way she'd looked at the crown molding when she said it, taking it in, assessing, stayed with me. Over the following months, Rochelle became a fixture. She was charming with guests and cold in private moments she didn't know I could see. She started making suggestions to my son about the house. The kitchen was dated. The master bath needed updating. Did I know a good contractor? She'd moved from complimenting the place to renovating it in her mind before they'd even gotten engaged. My son is not a foolish man, but he is a kind one, maybe to a fault. He wanted to believe in people. He'd had a rough stretch in his late 20s. A girlfriend who borrowed $3,800 for a family emergency that turned out to be fabricated. A friend who talked him into putting money into an app that never launched. Both times I'd raised flags, and both times he'd told me I was too suspicious. Both times I'd been right. I'd learned to be patient. I watched Rochelle work. She'd filter questions through my son like a ventriloquist. Has your dad ever thought about putting you on the deed now? What happens to the house if something happens to him? Is there a will? Are the investments in his name alone? Each question delivered casually, framed as practical thinking, wrapped in just enough genuine-sounding concern to make my son feel like she was being responsible. She was working backward from what she thought she'd inherit. When my son told me he was going to propose, I hugged him. I told him I was happy for him. I looked at the ring he'd picked out, an antique piece that he'd saved for over 8 months, and I felt genuine pride in the man he'd become. And then I went home and called my attorney and made sure the prenuptial agreement was in place before the wedding. I'd framed it as standard practice, something the attorney's office recommended for anyone with family trust assets above a certain threshold. My son was a little embarrassed to bring it up. Rochelle had signed it quickly, barely looking at it, probably confident it was boilerplate she'd have years to navigate around. She wasn't wrong that she had years. She was wrong about the navigation. The wedding was elaborate. Rochelle had insisted on a venue that ran $62,000, flowers that cost $14,000, a dress she wouldn't name the price of, but that I later learned was $9,000. My son paid for most of it himself, too proud to ask for help. I gave them $25,000 as a wedding gift. Rochelle kissed my cheek at the reception and called me generous, and I watched her eyes, the same quick inventory she'd done the night we met, cataloging what else there might be. After the wedding, they moved into the condo my son had bought himself 6 years earlier. It was a good place. 3 bedrooms, a parking spot, a small balcony. Within 2 months, Rochelle had decided it wasn't enough. She wanted to move into my house. The way she raised it was clever. I was getting older, wasn't I? The property was a lot to manage alone. It would save them money, and they could help with upkeep. She genuinely cared about me. It would be a blessing for everyone. I heard it in fragments, always through my son, always framed as concern. I shut it down calmly and directly. The house stays as it is. I saw the flash of something real in her face before she covered it with a smile. Of course, Dad. Whatever you think is best. After that, she worked differently. She stopped pushing through my son and started looking for the information herself. I'd noticed about 14 months into the marriage that she'd started connecting to my home network when they visited. I have a decent setup, a router with logging built in. I started reviewing the history. What I found was methodical and patient. Search after search on topics she'd never mentioned out loud. Spousal rights to inherited property in Colorado, how to challenge a prenuptial agreement, estate trust loopholes, when a surviving spouse has legal claim, how long must you be married for equitable distribution. A year's worth of quiet research conducted in my living room while I made coffee in the kitchen. She'd been building a case she expected to eventually use. I didn't confront it. I copied everything to a file and gave it to my attorney. The attic had been locked since my son was young. When he was small, I told him the floor was unfinished and unsafe. When he was older, I said it was storage for things I wasn't ready to sort through after his mother died, which was true as far as it went. It held Cecile's things, her journals, her collection of first edition novels, the photographs from before I knew her, and from every year of our life together, the trust documents in a fireproof lockbox, and, in a sealed envelope at the bottom of the lockbox, a letter she'd written to our son 2 weeks before she died, which she'd given to me to hold until I felt the time was right. I'd been holding it for 22 years. When Rochelle started coming over more frequently, I changed the combination. I chose something she'd never guess. Cecile's employee ID number from the firm where she'd worked for 2 decades. Not a date, not a name, nothing sentimental that could be researched. A number. She found it anyway. I still don't know exactly how. The best I can figure, She watched me through the crack of a doorway on a Sunday afternoon when she thought I'd left for the store. She was patient, she was thorough, and 3 weeks after I changed the code, she was in the attic. The flight home from Knoxville was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I sat by the window and thought about Cecile. About the way she used to reach across the kitchen table and squeeze my hand when she could see I was worried about something. About how she'd known, even in her 40s, that the world contained people who saw our son not as a person but as a set of resources to be managed. She'd built something that could outlast her, outlast me, outlast whatever anyone might try to do. I just had to be there when it mattered. I pulled into my driveway at 8:47 in the evening. Both cars were there. My son's pickup and the silver SUV Rochelle had convinced him to co-sign on 2 years ago, $71,000. He was making payments of $840 a month. Before that, he'd driven a perfectly good 7-year-old sedan with a paid-off title. She'd called it embarrassing for a man his age. I sat in the car for a moment. Cecile's voice, not how it sounds in memory, but how it felt. Present, steady, certain. You know what to do. You've always known. I got out and walked to the front door. My son opened it before I could use my key. He looked the way he used to look the one time he got into serious trouble in high school. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for hours and didn't know how to set it down. His eyes were red at the rims. He hadn't shaved. "Dad," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming." Behind him, Rochelle appeared in the hallway. She was dressed casually, fitted jeans, a silk top, but there was nothing casual about the way she held herself. She looked like someone who'd been preparing for this conversation and had just remembered she was supposed to be the one in control of it. "Elliot," she said. "My name, not Dad, not Mr. Just my name, as if we were on equal footing in a business negotiation." "We need to sit down." "Yes," I said. "We do." We arranged ourselves in the living room. I took the chair I've sat in for 30 years, the leather one that still has the slight impression of my shape worn into the left armrest. My son sat on the couch like he was expecting to be called on in class. Rochelle sat at the other end, angled toward me. "I know what's in the lockbox," she said. Not as an accusation, just as the opening move. "I found the documents. I read them. And I want to know why your son has been kept in the dark about his own inheritance for 3 years of marriage." "The documents were there when we married," I said. "They've been there since Cecile created them nearly a quarter century ago. And you didn't think he deserved to know?" My son spoke before I could answer. "Dad, I didn't know about any of this. The trust, the restrictions, any of it. Is that true?" The pain in his voice was the thing I'd dreaded most. Not Rochelle's anger, not the confrontation. The look on my son's face that said he was genuinely uncertain whether I'd been protecting him or managing him. "Yes," I said. "It's true, and I should have explained all of it sooner. That's on me." Rochelle's expression shifted slightly. She'd expected me to defend the secrecy, and I'd undercut her framing before she could use it. "Your mother established that trust 6 months before she died," I said, looking at my son. "She was a paralegal for most of her adult life. She knew how these things worked. She'd watched her grandmother lose everything to a man who married her, for access to what she had. She didn't want that for you. She asked me to protect it until you were established, until the right moment. I waited too long to explain it, and I'm sorry for that. But everything she built is still there, intact." "So, the prenuptial agreement," Rochelle said. "That was part of this." "The prenuptial agreement is standard practice for assets held in a family trust above a certain value. My attorney recommended it," I said. Which was technically true, though it had been my idea first. "I want to know exactly what I'm entitled to," she said. "After 3 years. After every—" "That's what I want to explain to you," I said. "Clearly. The house is held in the trust. The investment accounts are held in the trust. My life insurance names my son as the sole beneficiary with proceeds flowing directly into the trust. The prenuptial agreement you signed specifies that those assets remain separate property in the event of divorce. You have no legal claim to any of it." The room went very quiet. Rochelle set her jaw. Her fingers on the armrest went still. "You did this on purpose," she said. "I protected my son. Yes, from me. From anyone who might see him as a means to an end rather than a person to love." She turned to my son. "Are you going to sit here and let him talk to me this way? I'm your wife." He didn't answer right away. He was looking at his hands, and I could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes, all the small things that hadn't added up clicking into place. "Rochelle," he said carefully, "when we first met you told me you'd left your last job because the company culture was toxic, that you were between things but had a lot of opportunities lined up. Do you remember that? She looked at him. It's been 38 months, he said, and I have never once seen a deposit from you into our joint account. Not one. The car, the furniture, the trips. That's all been me. I've been working 50-hour weeks, and I thought you were job hunting, and I kept telling myself the market was tough, the timing wasn't right, you'd land something soon. He paused. Was any of that true? The silence stretched. Something in Rochelle's face changed. Not softened. It was more like she decided the pretense had cost more than it was worth. I didn't want a job, she said. I wanted a life where I didn't have to worry about money. I thought marrying you meant that. I thought your family had real money, money we could actually use, and then I found out it was all locked up in some trust your mother built to keep me out. My son actually leaned back from her, like the words had a physical force. You married me because you thought I was rich. I married you because you were kind, and I liked you. And yes, because I thought we'd have financial security. That's not dishonest. People think about that, but you lied about the rest, he said, about wanting to work, about trying, about what you wanted from this marriage. Rochelle looked at me with something close to hatred. Then she looked back at my son. You have to choose, she said, me or him. If you let him get away with this, with treating me like a suspect for 3 years, with cutting me out of a family's finances while I gave up my independence to build a life with you, then we're done. You choose. My son was quiet for a long time. The television was off. The house was the kind of still it gets in winter, when there's nothing moving outside and the furnace clicks on in the walls. She never asked about your mother, he said finally. Not once in 3 years. Not her name. Not what she was like. Not where she grew up or what she cared about. I used to try to bring her up, and Rochelle would change the subject. I told myself it was because she felt awkward about the loss. But I think she just wasn't interested in anyone she couldn't get something from. He looked at me. Tell her to leave. The SUV pulled out of the driveway at 10:23 p.m. She'd packed quickly, one large bag and a tote, refusing to look at either of us on the way out. At the door she paused. I need money for tonight, she said to my son. He handed her $80. She looked at the bills for a moment like she was deciding whether it was worth saying something. Then she left. The house settled into itself. My son sat down on the staircase and put his face in his hands, and I sat next to him and didn't say anything for a while because there wasn't anything useful to say. He cried in the way men his age cry when they've been holding it together too long, quiet and ashamed of it and unable to stop. I put my hand on his back. I really thought she loved me, he said. Not all the time, but some of it. Some of it felt real. I think she did, in her way, I said. But it was a love with conditions attached, the kind that holds up fine as long as everything's going her way. Why didn't you tell me? What you suspected? Would you have listened? He thought about it honestly. No, he said, I wouldn't have. I would have thought you were holding on too tight. I would have chosen her. That's why I did it the way I did it. I made sure you were protected, and I waited. He looked at the ceiling. I thought I was pretty good at reading people. You are. You're also generous, which sometimes makes it harder to see. Your mother was the same way. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and one of the things that worried her most about you. He was quiet a moment. Tell me about the trust. I want to know everything, so I told him. All of it. The 3 afternoons Cecile had spent at the attorney's office. The specific decisions she'd made, the language she'd chosen, the way she'd thought about protecting him, not from struggle but from exploitation. The house and the investments and the life insurance folded into a structure worth a little over $1 million too, depending on the market. The prenuptial agreement I'd insisted on after that first dinner with Rochelle. He listened without interrupting. Why were you going to wait until I was 40? Your mother thought 40 was the right age. Old enough to have made some real mistakes. Young enough to use it well. That was her thinking. I agreed with it. He nodded slowly. I'm 37, I know. After tonight, I think we should meet with the attorney together. You should understand exactly what you have and what it means. No more secrets. He stood and looked toward the attic door. Can I go up? It's your house too, I said. We went up together. The attic runs the full length of the house, with a bare plank floor and a single hanging bulb that Cecile and I always meant to replace with something better and never did. The lockbox was open. Rochelle had gotten into it somehow, though the letter was still sealed, untouched in its envelope. Maybe she'd seen it wasn't a financial document. Maybe she just hadn't cared. My son walked slowly past the shelves of his mother's things. Her novels, spine up, organized by author the way she always kept them. 3 wooden crates of photographs, each year labeled in her handwriting on a strip of masking tape. Her sewing basket, which I'd kept because it smelled like her hand lotion for an embarrassingly long time after she was gone. He picked up a photograph from one of the open boxes. Cecile, at maybe 26, standing on the steps of a courthouse in the dress she'd worn when we got our marriage license, laughing at something I'd said that I no longer remembered. She looked so young, he said. She was. We both were. He looked at the envelope at the bottom of the lockbox. She left me something? She wrote it about 2 weeks before she died. She'd had some kind of sense that things were different toward the end, though the doctors hadn't said anything alarming yet. She asked me to hold it until I thought you were ready. He picked it up. He held it for a moment without opening it. Was tonight the right moment? I think so, yes. He opened it carefully, like he was trying not to damage it, and read for a long time. I stood at the window and looked at the neighborhood below, the same view Cecile and I had looked at from up here when we first bought the place, back when most of the trees were saplings. When he finished, he folded the pages and held them against his chest. She knew, he said. She knew exactly what could happen. She understood people, I said, the good kind and the other kind, and she loved you enough to plan for both. He stood in the attic for another few minutes without speaking, just looking at the shelves, at the crates, at the bare bulb throwing its flat yellow light across everything. She's been here the whole time, he said, the whole time this house has been standing. She never really left, I agreed. We went downstairs and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table until almost 2 a.m. talking. He asked me questions I should have answered years ago, and I answered them. He was angry sometimes and sad sometimes, and once, around midnight, he laughed at something his mother used to say, and it sounded so much like him as a boy that I had to look away for a second. The divorce took 5 months. The prenuptial agreement was exactly what it was designed to be, airtight. Rochelle's attorney looked at it and apparently counseled her to take the settlement rather than fight, which she did. She left with what she'd brought, her personal belongings, her clothing, and a car loan she couldn't afford. Last I heard she'd moved to Phoenix. My son moved back into his condo and threw himself into work. For a while he was too quiet when we talked on the phone, but gradually the conversations got longer. He came for Sunday dinners and sometimes stayed late, helping me sort through things in the attic, deciding together what to keep and what to let go. We found 3 more boxes of Cecile's photographs neither of us had seen since we'd packed them up. We found a birthday card she'd written to him on his 13th birthday, that he'd never found at the time because he'd been at a friend's house when she left it, and by the time he got home she'd tucked it into a drawer and forgotten to mention it. He read it standing in the hallway and didn't say anything for a while. About 8 months after the night Rochelle left, he called me on a Tuesday. Not from distress this time, just to talk. I met someone at a conference last week, he said. Nothing serious. We got coffee yesterday, and she made a point of splitting the check. Made kind of a production of it, actually. Said she had a rule about always paying her own way at least the first few times. I felt something ease in my chest. Sounds like someone worth a second cup of coffee, I said. I think so, too. Her name's Adrienne. She's a civil engineer. She asked about my family, and I told her everything. The divorce, the reason for it, all of it. Figured if it scared her off, I'd rather know early. What did she say? She said she respected it. Said her dad went through something similar, and she thought he was a fool for not protecting himself. She wasn't scared off. Good, I said. We were quiet for a moment in the comfortable way you can only be quiet with someone you've been through something real with. Dad, he said, I've been thinking about the trust, about what to do with it eventually. What are you thinking? I don't need it to survive. I never did. I built my own career, my own savings. What Mom built, I think it should mean something beyond just sitting there. He paused. What if we used most of it to start a scholarship fund? For kids who lose a parent young, help cover college costs. We could call it the Cecile Bramwell Memorial Scholarship. Cecile Bramwell, my wife's name, which she'd kept even after we married because she'd built a professional reputation under it and saw no reason to change. I couldn't speak for a moment. She'd have loved that, I finally said. I figured. He was quiet again. I also figured she'd tell me the best inheritance was never the money. It was knowing how to recognize someone worth trusting. She would have said exactly that. We made plans to meet with the attorney the following week. I walked him through the attic one more time before he went back to his condo, and this time it didn't feel like a repository of grief. It felt like a room where someone had thought carefully about the future and left what was needed for it to go well. I still keep the combination as Cecile's employee ID. I see no reason to change it. After my son left that evening, I stood in the kitchen for a while in the dark. Not sad, exactly. Something quieter than that. The house had been through something that would have broken it, and it was still standing. My son had been through something that would have broken some men, and he was the better for having been through it. Cecile had looked at a world full of people who would eventually want what we'd built, and decided the only answer was to build it in a way they couldn't reach. She'd been gone for 22 years, and she'd still won. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The attic door was locked again. It would stay that way, probably, for a while longer. But what it held now felt different than it had for years. Less like something I was guarding, and more like something we were keeping together, the three of us, in the particular way you keep someone when the only place left for them is memory. And that, I've come to understand, is more than enough.